Well, it's great to be here. I'm very excited to see all of you, and your just youthful enthusiasm. It makes me feel young again. So can we get my slides up? So I actually can't see my own presentation, so I'm going to try to read it backwards over here. So I have this message for all of you, which is be disruptive, take risk, and do not fear failure. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to try to make it pretty personal, because in my life, I try to be disruptive, take risks, and not fear failing. So can we get the next slide? Why should you do this? Why is it important to have this view? Next. It's because all of you in this room have to change the world. And the kind of things that we need to change are very important problems that exist today in healthcare, in environment, in economic disparity, in energy, in things like waste management, education, elder care. These problems are global problems today. They're only getting worse, and they're going to need youth such as yourselves to go solve them. Thank you. Hello? All right. So, you guys are the ones who have to change the world. So the real question is, what could stop you? Next slide. What can stop you from changing the world? You have enough energy, you have talent, you have enthusiasm, you have support of society around you. What can stop you? Next slide. And the thing that can stop you and can stop anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur is fear. Next slide. And it is a fear of failure that stops most people. In the last 7 years, I've started 11 different companies in 11 different countries outside of the United States. And I've seen how culture in different countries stops entrepreneurship. And the biggest cultural problem I see is the fear of failure. Many countries and many societies have this notion that you should be totally successful and that you should never fail. And this notion that you should succeed in every single thing you do is what stops you from taking risk, which stops you from being disruptive. Next. Next slide. So I'm going to give an example out of my own life. A lot of places I go, they talk about my success at Microsoft. And Microsoft, of course, was a very successful company. And so this is going to be a little bit detailed and graphic, but here's a kind of graph of the stock price of Microsoft while I was at the company. And you can see I showed up here around just before, at the early '89. And the stock price was like very small. And when I left in the summer of '99, Microsoft had hit its all-time stock high. In fact, I left the week that it was at its all-time historical high. Now that, of course, had nothing to do, the drop had nothing to do with my leaving, but you can see that the ratchet up of that stock price was amazing. Everyone thinks that's a success. Next slide. While I was there, I worked on starting Windows NT, Office, Microsoft Research. Next. Worked on our object strategy and our large data strategy with SQL Server. Next. I worked on the Internet and Media Groups. Next. And then they made me chief software architect at the company, where I ran strategy. So this all sounds like a really great success. Next slide. But in fact, I was considered one of the worst executives at Microsoft during the first few years I was there. You can see here, I've amplified the scale. And for the first few years I was there, the share price rose quite a bit, about $3.50, almost 5 times up. But during that time, my projects lost billions of dollars. In fact, I'm one of the people who lost over $1 billion in our telecom strategy, and then proceeded to lose another $2 billion on the projects that I ran. So that's why I was considered one of the worst executives there, because I lost so much damn money. Next slide. But it's useful to look at this in a larger context. So I've now zoomed out and zoomed the y-axis, and basically the entire previous slide fits into this little chunk here. And it turns out that the products I worked on that lost so much money early on, like Windows NT and like Office and so on, ended up producing a cumulative net revenue of $25 billion for the company. The reason I talk about this, and I first showed this slide when I was invited by the chairman of Samsung to talk about why I was the most successful Korean in technology. And I told him it's because I was given the room to fail. I asked the chairman of Samsung, if I was working at Samsung, when would you have fired me? And he said, you would not have lasted the single year. Because the moment you lost that first $1 billion, we would have gotten rid of you. And I said, well, then I never would have created the valuable products that actually made the next $25 billion for the company, and now cumulatively have made over $100 billion for the company, if I was not given the opportunity to fail for 5 years. And so I think that's an interesting lesson about how success can come from failure. Next slide. And this is just one 10-year chapter in my life. I did a chip startup, which had quite a lot of failures in it too. I ran a consulting company. I started off as an English major in school, and I got kind of kicked out of that. I got kicked out of medical school too, so I got kicked out of more schools than actually I graduated. I actually was also got into a lot of trouble as a computer hacker. There's a funny story that when I came to Microsoft, I met an old friend of mine, and I had cracked Microsoft Excel, which had a copy protection in it. And he celebrated this, my friend, in front of the Excel product manager. And I was only about 3 weeks in the company, and I found that a little bit disconcerting. So again, failure and success are very related to each other. You have to be able to fail in order to succeed. So you shouldn't be afraid of it. Next slide. You know, after Microsoft, I went off and started intellectual ventures with a friend of mine, Nathan Myhrvold. And it started off like any startup, just kind of a wild, stupid idea. That's me with my hair down. And that was our first office. Literally 2 of us in one office, in a warehouse. Next slide. We scaled it up and moved into a nicer building, and I wore a nicer suit. And then, next slide. Ended up building, I think, what's considered a very bright future. When we started off with our wild idea, we had no money, and nobody would give us any money because they thought the idea was too crazy. We spent 3 years raising money, and we were very, very happy when we raised our first $50 million in our fund. Today, we now manage over $6.5 billion, and we're on the path to try to raise another 3 or 4. So again, it turns out that you can start from something small and build something big. And we had lots of failures on the way. I used to tell the people who started the company with me that we will fail more often than we succeed. And I still run a product group right now inside of Intellectual Ventures where our goal essentially is to fail 80% of the time. Next. What we've been able to build, though, is something very important, I think, for all of us to think about. I talked yesterday with the Startup Nations group about how the future of innovation is going to be about partnership. How we went through 100 years of innovation, mostly in the United States, which was all about single people, the power of one, single people, single companies, single products, and single countries being successful. And how in the next 100 years, it's not going to be the power of one, it's going to be the power of many. It's going to be people such as yourselves being able to connect and integrate across boundaries of country, across boundaries of company, across boundaries of product, of nationality, and so on, in order to create a much more livable and interesting future. Next. And so, to sum up, the notion here is that you have to be able to take risk. Next. And you have to be able to manage that personally. Next. The first part of it, which many of you are doing already, is to make sure you seek help. You're not alone, and when you take risks, you need to find other people to share the risk with you. I travel a lot trying to push new ideas all over the world, and I know that only 1 or 2% of the people I talk to will join me in my new idea. That means I have to talk to a lot of people and collect a lot of business cards before I'll find the small number of partners who will help me out. But it is the most important thing to do early on, is to find those people who will help you. Next. The second thing is to know yourself. There's a temptation sometimes to do everything yourself, but let's face it, you're not good at everything. And one of the most important things to learn is what you really are good at and what you're not. Because the places where you're not good, you have to go find help. And the places where you are good, you can help others. And so knowing yourself is a very important thing. It's not something you learn in school. It's something you have to learn how to do on your own. Next. This is also an important point. I tell a lot of people who are entrepreneurs, you must believe optimistic, but plan conservative. Entrepreneurs are the most optimistic people on earth because they believe they can succeed, even though statistics show that they will mostly fail. So you have to believe optimistically that you can succeed and bring the people along with you who will help you succeed. But at the same time, when you plan, you have to plan around the possibility that you will fail. So believing optimistically but planning conservatively is a very important survival trait in being an entrepreneur. Next. And if you do all of this and you fail, which will happen from time to time, I never consider it a failure as long as you're learning from your failure. Why did you fail? Don't make the same mistake twice. Figure out whether it was something you did or something that just is beyond your control. And if it's beyond your control, just let it go. If you learn from your failure, it isn't really a failure at all, because you always get to start up and try again. Next. Next. So here's a few quotes. Henry Ford saying that failure is really only the opportunity to begin again, but this time more wisely. Again, learning from your mistakes. Next. This is a quote from Thomas Edison, where he claimed after having a failed experiment that he's not failed. He's just found 10,000 ways that don't work. I like this particular quote because I tell people in my own organization that when you fail a lot, you actually have an advantage over all those other people who haven't failed a lot because they have yet to learn those 10,000 ways that don't work. And then I'll quote myself last. Click. Failure is an option. There's an American saying that failure is not an option. It's totally wrong. Failure is totally an option, and it's one you should exercise frequently. Next. So if you do not fear failure, because it's your friend, next. Nothing can stop you, next. from solving these big problems. And so I really hope you take this to heart, because you are the future. You're the people who are going to solve these big problems. You're the ones who are going to help me have energy, clean water, great food, and live for a very long time. So I really hope next that you go do it. Thank you.